Okay, guys, good morning. Yes, good morning, everyone. Hope everyone's having a great morning. So today's talk will be deconstructing dark patterns, ethical design principles for React developers. Let's begin. So a little bit about me before we get started. My name is Selam Moges. I'm a software engineer by trade. Prior to that, I studied at New York University and graduated with a computer science degree. And I'm passionate about accessibility, inclusion, and activism in the tech space. So to begin, I kind of like to give 5 bullets about what we'll be talking about today in general, just to give a lay of the land. So first, why does ethical design matter? The definition of dark patterns, where they come from, and why we should care. Third, we'll be going through categories of dark patterns with examples. Next, we'll look at how do dark patterns appear in React apps. And lastly, ethical design principles for us, React developers. So why does ethical design matter? Sometimes when people see this question, or when they see why does responsible tech matter, what they might actually see is why does doing the right thing matter? And doing the right thing is pretty obvious why we should do it. But that doesn't necessarily move the needle for businesses and corporations that care about profits, margins, and ROI. So here, the best way we can actually instill ethical design principles at the technical level is showing the benefits and consequences of ethical design or the lack thereof. So now let's look at how ethical design can improve a couple areas. So I'd like to highlight 3 specifically. First, user trust and adoption. Next, brand value. And lastly, costly band-aid solutions. So starting from the top with user trust and adoption. To illustrate how ethical design can improve user trust and adoption, let's first start with the core idea or core axiom of this argument that we'll be hinging on. So the core idea here is that when users feel respected and in control, they're more likely to stay, return, and recommend your product. And let's use Apple's app tracking transparency as an example to kind of highlight this point. So the core problem that Apple's ATT was trying to address is that apps could track user behavior across other apps and websites without explicit permission. And most users didn't know that this was happening, and trust in mobile apps began to erode. So in 2021, Apple made this ethical design decision to introduce ATT. And I'm sure if you have an iPhone, you've probably seen this pop up when you first download an app. And really, to explicitly ask the user and prompt them in a clear, non-coercive, and respectful way. Now, user trust and adoption is kind of gained through 3 ways. 1, it's through consent. 2, clarity in what you're asking. And 3, empowering the user to make an informed decision. Now, let's look at how this actually affected Apple. So I'd like to highlight 2 points here. So the first is user trust boost. So Apple positioned itself as a privacy forward, gaining user trust, and even after ad companies were kind of pushing back on it. And secondly, adoption and retention. Consumers increasingly saw Apple as a safe ecosystem. Despite the slight dip in ad revenue, the user loyalty kind of grew. Now, this is all great, but what do the numbers actually say about this? So a study done by Acquia in 2021 stated that 63% of consumers stated that the initiative was either somewhat good or very good. And then 81% of marketers surveyed voiced support for ATT, indicating a desire to rebuild consumer trust through greater transparency. Next, we'll be looking at the importance of brand value. Now, brand value itself is closely tied to reputation and ultimately revenue. So avoiding deceptive design decisions protect the brand and help companies stay ahead of regulation and lawsuits. So let's take a look at how Amazon Prime's cancellation lawsuit as an example. So we'll talk about this more later, but currently, Amazon is battling an ongoing lawsuit with the FTC, or the Federal Trade Commission, on their use of dark patterns, specifically when users try to cancel their Amazon Prime membership. Now, why does this matter to the brand? How does this affect the bottom dollar? Let's take a look. So this lawsuit can kind of go two ways, right? They either win or they lose. So let's go through the path of if they actually won this lawsuit. Well, it still affects their reputation, which in turn affects their brand, which, as we spoke, those two things kind of affect them, causing a loss in customers. Losing customers means losing money. Now, if they lost the lawsuit, it's kind of clear what happens. There'll be some sort of major payout, which again, in turn, you lose money. So it's in the company's best interest to avoid deceptive design that can land them into these tricky situations like this. And lastly, let's look at costly band-aid solutions. Now, retrofitting inclusivity can be a costly solution as opposed to embedding it in the product development pipeline itself. Now, let's take a look at the Cambridge Analytica scandal to kind of use that as an example of this problem. So let's just kind of go through the timeline of what actually happened just to level set everyone's understanding. So firstly, Facebook allowed third-party apps to access user data. And this affected around 87 million users, and their data was misused for political ads. Now, some users weren't actually even aware that this was actually going on, and it was only until after when news reports actually wrote about this unearthing this scandal. Now, how did this affect Facebook? So Facebook had to retrofit privacy controls, overhaul APIs, change their consent models. This is all a lot of work that they had to do. But even from the financial side, there was a $5 billion fine from the FTC. And then when you look at the brand side, this was a massive hit to their brand and reputation and user trust. And ultimately, this sparked global scrutiny and regulation, the GDPR enforcement, congressional hearings, and things like that. Now, it's great that they were able to make the necessary changes because it's better to make the changes than not to have it at all. But the cost of retrofitting inclusivity, as opposed to baking it into the actual product development cycle, creates the following problems. There's money loss, as we saw with the FTC fine, software refactoring, which if anyone is an engineer knows is a lot of work and really annoying. And lastly, additional time spent on the designer side, the PM side, the engineer side, trying to quickly solve this problem that could have been addressed all throughout the cycle. So far, we've talked about ethical design and why it matters, how it affects the brand, user trust, and the overall product. Through examples, we've seen the general consequences of not having it, but let's now bridge the gap between idealism, which is having this perfect ethical product that makes millions and millions of dollars and everyone's happy, with the actual implementation, because everything has trade-offs, right? And when you actually do something and how you actually do it ultimately always has trade-offs. And we'll be bridging this gap and looking at this all through the technical design. So here's a pyramid that I'd like to talk about that kind of stack ranks the importance of things when building an actual product from the engineer's perspective. So the first thing and the most important thing to think about is when first building something, you're just trying to get it to work. Doesn't matter how good it looks, doesn't matter how optimized it is, we're just trying to get it to work. Let's just start there. Then after that, you might think, okay, is this the best way to do it? Is this the most optimal way to do it? Is it the cleanest way to do it? Is it fast enough? And then after that, you might think about, can we support the growth? We have 10 users today, we might have 1 million tomorrow. Can it handle it? After that, we might think about, okay, can all these different types of users use it after the MVP, after the majority can use it? And lastly, you might think about maybe the ethics of it, the consent. Should we build it this way? What are the consequences of opening Pandora's box like this? So this is how priorities are often stacked in engineering culture. We focus on the performance, the shipping, the scalability, and then we kind of leave the ethical concerns for later, if at all. And granted, most developers aren't waking up in the morning and deciding to trick users, but when we prioritize growth at all costs without questioning the design, we risk embedding manipulation into the product by default. And once these choices scale, they start becoming invisible and they become normalized, and ultimately they become a pattern, which leads us into what are dark patterns. We kind of briefly mentioned these dark patterns in our discussion with Amazon Prime's cancellation, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, but let's actually go into the definition. So, shortly, dark patterns are UX designs that are meant to trick or manipulate users to perform a forced action. Now, there are a bunch. I've highlighted 6, but there are a bunch of these, and we'll be going into a couple of them. And all these you're probably familiar with, even though you don't know the name necessarily. And we'll be going through actually the contextual history next about where these actually come from. And surprisingly, dark patterns historical context starts before the internet. So before 1983, pre-internet sales tactics, so long before the web, manipulative techniques were used in retail and advertising. Things like bait and switch tactics, fine printing contracts, and infomercials exploiting urgency, if you remember the call now. Next, between the mid-2000s and 2010s, we have the A/B testing boom and conversion-focused culture led to UX being weaponized and growth hacks pushing metrics like time on site, retention, and upsell at all cost. Now, finally, in 2010, this term dark pattern was coined by Harry Brignall, an independent UX designer and advocate, and he actually launched darkpatterns.org to kind of document deceptive design and categorize them. Now, this formalized the conversation and gave people the vocabulary to name what felt kind of wrong. Now we're heading into 2018 to 2020. That's when regulatory scrutiny kind of played into this, and the GDPR and CCPA began holding companies accountable for misleading UI. And then we also have public backlash increased across all these different companies, and they were being called out. And then lastly, research from institutions like Princeton and MIT started studying dark patterns in depth. And lastly, the 2020s, pretty much now, heading towards accountability and ethical design. So as users become more tech savvy, trust and transparency are key differentiators. And tech companies like Apple and Mozilla are making privacy and clarity a selling point. And there's a growing movement towards ethical design systems, inclusive design, and privacy-first frameworks, a great momentum for developers to lead responsibly. So next, we'll be talking about some of my least favorite dark patterns. I'd like to highlight 2 of them. So the first one is confirm shaming. So this dark pattern works by triggering uncomfortable emotions such as guilt or shame to influence a user's decision-making. So what does this look like? These 2 here. So I won't name any names of where I got this from, but this was out in the wild. And something like, no, don't protect my $600 trip, or don't protect my $800 trip. Or something like over there, like, no, thanks, I really hate saving money. And maybe they won't use these exact words, but something like this, where it's like, okay, obviously I like to save money. Obviously, this isn't a good feeling, right? And so again, the vocabulary around this, and this is called confirm shaming, kind of making you feel guilty about the decision you want to make. Now, how does this show up in code? Well, it's pretty simple. It's actually just the string. It's just the language, right? So it'll be a button and then some sort of language asking you like, are you sure you want to do this? things like that. Now, let's look at the differences. Let's get a little closer into it. So here on the right, we'll have an example where it says, no, don't protect my $600 trip. And if we actually look closer, we can see that there's guilty language for the no option. The green colored text for yes answers subtly signals that it's the primary action, while the blue text kind of signals that it's like the secondary action. When we think about it, they should both be neutral actions because we want the user to have agency, right? So if we compare that to maybe doing something like this, like, yes, protect my trip, or no, I'll skip for now. And this side has neutral clear language and neutral coloring. Now, this is kind of the ideal situation of just having an ethical opt-out as opposed to something that's guilting the user to make a specific action. Now, before I go to the next one, raise your hand if you have a subscription to anything. Now, raise your hand if that said subscription, you're like, oh yeah, I'm definitely going to cancel it in 2 weeks before I get charged. And you forgot. Yeah. Well, that is called forced continuity. And its users are automatically charged for a subscription after a free trial without adequate notice or just easy cancellation, often requiring them to actively opt out. Super annoying. We've all done it. We all hate it. And what does this look like programmatically? Again, super simple, right? So it'll probably have some sort of vague cancellation statement like cancel anytime. And then in super, super fine print, we'll charge you in 30 days if you don't. And then there's also this some sort of like hidden auto charge logic, hidden from the user's perspective, but obviously seen somewhere in the coding logic. Now, how could we make this slightly better? Although it's a little bit blurry for you, I'd like to just highlight 2 points again. Having some sort of clear statement on the sign-up process on when they'll be charged, and then just adding some sort of additional functionality where you get an email, you get a text saying like, hey, you will be charged in a day or 2 days if you don't cancel. Or even better, go for an opt-in versus an opt-out approach. The difference between those two is users should have the agency to sign up for the subscription versus having to find out how to get out of the subscription after the trial period has ended. So from the UI perspective, again, both of them are pretty similar, but there's clear differences. So the right side, you can see no clear cancellation date. And then what's not obvious from this is a forced opt-in, where they automatically charge you after X number of days or weeks. A better approach would be to have a clear text saying when something is going to happen, or just ideally, you'll just get downgraded to the free version after the trial is over. Or another option is having some sort of checkbox saying, hey, we've acknowledged that this is what's going to happen after the fact. And then again, having that text message, email, or something to just give the user a reminder. So the next one I'd like to talk about here is Roach Motel. So users can easily sign up for a service but have a hard time leaving the service. It's super intuitive and to actually sign up for the subscription, but then it takes a million steps to actually cancel. So let's just walk through an example together. So let's say I have a newsletter app and I'm going to log into the account. If I wanted to subscribe, I navigate to the subscription settings. After that, I pick a plan that works for me. And then I'm done. I've signed up. Now, conversely, let's say I want to cancel. Well, I'd probably just do the same thing, right? I'd log into my account. I'd navigate to the subscription settings, find the cancellation section. Oh, gotta call to cancel. Okay, finally, I get to a human. I finally get to talk to an associate and I say, hey, I'd like to cancel this. And maybe they come up with a bunch of different reasons why I shouldn't cancel rather. They use persuasive language or delay tactics. They ask you, why are you canceling in the first place? They offer some sort of retention deal to dissuade you. And then after I say, no, thank you, no, thank you, no, thank you, then I'm able to actually cancel my subscription. And although this is just a made up example, it isn't too far fetched from reality. And going back to what we were talking about earlier with Amazon Prime, let's say I want to sign up for Prime. It's one click to the join now. And then the second click, especially if I've already sent something without Amazon Prime, it only takes 2 clicks because they already have my information. So then all I have to do is click join Prime. And after the billing and everything else is confirmed, it's already done. Now, this highlights the automatic opt-in too. So you can't really see what it says here, but the last thing it says is like, hey, you're going to be charged, cancel anytime. And this highlights the automatic opt-in to the subscription plan as opposed to an option where users can actively opt in after the free trial is over. Now, I didn't necessarily go through this exercise of trying to cancel Amazon Prime, but a man by the name of Stephen actually went through this entire process, and he wrote an article about it, and also wrote this article about the FTC and Amazon Prime's cancellation lawsuit. So he went through this exercise of actually trying to cancel it, and it took about 10 to 15 clicks to actually get through the cancellation. And he highlights various things in this article, but I just wanted to highlight here how many steps it takes to cancel and versus how many steps it takes to subscribe. And if you'd actually like to read the article, I just wanted to highlight it here so you can scan the QR code. Okay, awesome. So we've seen how design can trap users through confusing flows, delayed friction, and hidden consequences. But what would it look like to build the opposite? So here we'll be using the clear framework that I kind of put together to describe how we should be building our products. So products and services should be built with first, consent, ask, don't assume. Second is legibility, having clear and honest labeling. Third is empowerment, so easy to reverse decisions. Fourth is accessibility, make it easy for anyone to use. And lastly, respect, build for user agency. And we'll be kind of going through each one with some examples. So the first one is consent, ask, don't assume. So the best practice here, and here's an example, is don't default users into billing, make them check a box. So that way the user actually knows. And then also just like how we talked before, sending notifications like, hey, this is going to happen, making sure it's super clear. Again, ask, don't assume. Next is legibility, and that's clear and honest labeling. And we saw examples of that too through other dark patterns and things like, no, I hate discounts, versus having an ethical alternative that's just neutral, clear to understand. And again, the best practice here is let users decline without that guilt or sarcasm. Empowerment. So empowerment here is looking to having control over your actions independently without shame. So there's a bunch of ways to shame people, and then there's a clear way not to do so. And here the goal is that users should have the ability to take and reverse actions easily and confidently. So a visible self-serve cancellation button is an example of empowerment. And then all of these here are ways to disempower the user. So although inaccessible UI is technically not considered a dark pattern, I wanted to highlight it here because we should still make things that everyone can actually use. And how we do that is having things like semantic HTML, ARIA labels and roles, sufficient contrast, and things like that. And again, if we look at the two examples here, we can see that there's not that much of a difference, but it makes a huge difference in the actual UI itself. And so the best practice here is just more accessible UI. And lastly, respect. This means designing in a way that respects the user's autonomy, intention, and intelligence. It's about not manipulating, not hiding choices, and not prioritizing conversion over consent. And again, what that looks like is just using honest, non-coercive language in your CTAs. So clear kind of gives us that North Star, a shared language for what ethical design should look like. But how do we actually put these values into motion during a real project? So here I'll have 6 steps next, kind of going through the product development cycle and then where we can actually incorporate ethical design. So during the discovery and intent phase, the goal here is to define the product's purpose. And here we can also add and potential ethical risks. So what does that actually look like? That's identifying user needs and not business manipulation goals, and also flag features that could exploit urgency, addiction, or confusion. Okay. Next is inclusive ideation and stakeholder input. And here is an opportunity to involve diverse perspectives early. So that can look like bringing in voices from underrepresented groups and accessibility advocates super early in the brainstorming session. Include legal, privacy, ethical specialists in the brainstorming phase. And lastly, use ethical checklists like CLEAR to guide direction. Third, design with transparency and empowerment. And the goal here is to translate ethical principles into UI, UX patterns. So that's using clear, neutral language to avoid confirm shaming, urgency. Next is prioritizing easy reversibility. So that's easy to find cancel or delete buttons. And lastly, show data practices. Why are we collecting this? What are we doing with this? Fourth, ethical prototyping and feedback. And the goal here is to test for ethical friction and misunderstanding. And how we can do that early, again, is conduct usability testing focused on trust, clarity, and ease of use. Second is asking testers, did you feel misled? Could you easily undo your actions and things like that? And third, iterating based on this feedback, especially around consent and clarity. Next is the implementation phase. So here we want to avoid embedding dark patterns into the logic. And how we can do that is using opt-in mechanisms, not just pre-checked boxes, and building ethical default components to make it easier for the next dev as well. And lastly, ethical QA and review. And the goal here is to test functionality and ethics together. And how we can do that is using ethical QA checklist alongside a technical one. And what an ethical QA checklist can kind of look like is, can users find and cancel subscriptions? Are any labels misleading or hiding outcomes? Does every user journey preserve user agency? Now, before I let you go, I'd like to highlight a couple books that kind of helped me on my ethical journey and kind of made me the engineer that I am today. And here you can scan this QR code because Design Justice actually has a Design Justice network and a Design Justice community on Slack. So if you want to talk to other people that are also interested in the ethical space and how it intersects with tech, you can scan here. I feel like I learned a lot from just listening, reading other people's work, and then also just reading all of these books. Now, if you'd like to connect with me personally, you can scan these QR codes for my website, my email, my LinkedIn, however way is easiest for you. Yeah, thank you so much.